This video was paid for by the Green Party of Ontario. Housing in Ontario is becoming absurdly expensive to buy or rent, and Premier Doug Ford doesn't seem interested in fixing it. He's ignored and even scoffed at recommendations from his own Housing Affordability Task Force, which made clear that Ontario has a housing shortage rooted in outdated zoning rules and make it difficult to build denser, more affordable types of housing. This video is an explainer on key parts of the Green Party of Ontario's housing platform, both for Ontario voters thinking about the upcoming election, but also anyone elsewhere curious about a pro-housing Green platform.
Yes to building more homes where people want to live. Yes, in my backyard.
And yes, Doug Ford has been disappointing not just on housing, but he's also the one threatening to rip out Toronto's bike network.
And making sure we remove these silly bike lanes.
And proposing a fantasy-tunneled highway under the 401.
$93.5 billion for the entire project.
For decades, much of Ontario's land has been zoned to only allow single-family homes, with heavier restrictions on townhouses and apartments. This exclusionary zoning limited housing options and stopped overall supply from keeping up with demand. In 2022, Ontario's Housing Affordability Task Force recommended shaking this up, including by allowing multiplexes up to 4 stories across the province. Multiplex is the catch-all term for duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, etc. Small-scale apartment buildings like you find across Montreal and Chicago. Doug Ford flat-out refused, saying 4-story towers in residential neighborhoods would be a disaster.
The Premier today shutting down calls to allow fourplexes in neighborhoods across Ontario, calling it a huge mistake.
It's off the table for us.
But having lived in Montreal and visited Chicago, buildings like this don't feel like a disaster. You can even find them sprinkled across mainly older neighborhoods in cities like Ottawa, Toronto, and Kitchener. Why not make them easier to build? The Greens have been pressing the Ford government to be bolder on housing, and their platform for the upcoming provincial election builds on the task force recommendations. They're proposing to allow multiplexes up to 4 stories on all residential land within urban boundaries, up to 4 or 6 units depending on the size of the city. What might that look like? Here's a classic Montreal triplex or triplex, 3 units across 3 floors. You can also find Montreal multiplexes with 2, 4, 5, or 6 units. This 4-story building in Chicago has 5 units, and this one has 6 based on the number of mailboxes out front. For a more suburban style, here's a recent 3-unit building in Edmonton, a city that's been really proactive on housing reform, which has helped it avoid the worst of the housing crisis that's plagued cities in Ontario and BC. Legalizing buildings like this won't turn your city into Montreal overnight, but if just 5 or 10% of lots are upgraded to 3, 4, or 6 unit multiplexes over a period of time, that's a big boost to housing supply without having to resort to sprawl and lengthy commutes. That's more housing options for people to downsize or upgrade, but stay in neighborhoods near friends and family. The Greens are also proposing provincial standards to make multiplexes not just legal, but actually practical to build. With provincial inaction, many Ontario cities have been implementing their own reforms, often with nudging from the federal government, but the devil is in the details. The owner of this home in Toronto wanted to build a fourplex to have rentals and an apartment for his widowed mother. Although fourplexes are now legal in Toronto, he was denied a permit to build one because of other rules, like that it would cover 37% of the lot instead of the allowed 33%. The Greens' proposal to allow more units and multiplexes in bigger cities, 6 instead of 4, also makes them easier to build. A recent analysis on Washington, D.C. found that the higher land costs typical of a bigger city can make some of the smaller multiplex projects not feasible. They recommend to achieve financial feasibility in today's market, local governments and states may need to enable the construction of 4, 5, 6, or even more units on previously single-family lots. Whereas in smaller cities in Ontario, duplexes and triplexes might be more feasible. On top of small-scale density, the Greens propose to allow mid-rises 6 to 11 stories by default along main streets and transit corridors in cities with populations over 100,000. That could look like this building in Montreal or this one in Ottawa. Places from BC to Massachusetts have been targeting transit in their housing reforms because it's a double win on affordability. More supply means cheaper housing, and more people living near transit means cheaper transportation, which for most households is the second biggest expense after housing. These two pillars would raise standards for how much density is allowed by default without a long and uncertain approval process. Builders could still go smaller if they wanted, for example 2 or 3 stories instead of 4, and cities could allow bigger if they wanted. One idea that I really like is rethinking public consultations where cities are deciding whether to approve projects that don't quite match the zoning. As they work now, consultations are notoriously biased towards negativity, being largely attended by close neighbors who aren't necessarily the most enthusiastic about change. One of the neighbors opposing this fourplex said that the hallmark of their neighborhood is that literally nothing ever changes. The Greens are proposing that public consultation should also seek out input from prospective or future residents. For example, people who live elsewhere in the city and who might be looking to move to be closer to work or to get a bigger place. If they don't already live nearby, they might not hear about the project or feel motivated to go. But they have a stake because they might plausibly move in or they might benefit in a more general way from the increased housing supply. Getting more people going to consultations to have more perspectives from renters or young people or first-time homebuyers has been a goal of Yes in My Backyard pro-housing groups for a while now, and it would be a major win to actually plan consultations around it. The Greens have lots of other housing proposals. Pre-approved building designs, financing for small-scale and nonprofit builders, a housing-first approach to homelessness, eliminating rules that require arbitrary amounts of parking in new developments, and tying provincial transit funding to building dense, transit-oriented development around stations. But the last one that I want to focus on here is development charges, a particularly big problem in Ontario. Development charges, or DCs, are fees on new housing to pay for infrastructure. They're not uncommon across jurisdictions, but as economists and even the Federal Housing Authority have observed, DCs have risen a lot in Ontario and don't necessarily reflect the actual infrastructure costs associated with development. Municipalities next door in Quebec, for example, tend to charge fewer and lower fees than ones in Ontario, one of a few different reasons why housing in Quebec is cheaper. The Greens are proposing to eliminate development charges on houses, condos, and apartments under 2,000 square feet within urban boundaries. 2,000 square feet is basically up to a medium-sized house. They would then cover the relevant infrastructure with provincial funding. Removing government charges on housing in the city of Toronto could reduce construction costs per unit by roughly 10 to 20% depending on the details of the type of home, according to the Federal Housing Authority, and that's based on development charges from a few years ago. To close, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but I can say that I appreciate the Ontario Greens being a strong voice on housing. The PCs commissioned a solid task force of housing experts but got nervous about actually implementing the recommendations. The Liberal platform tackles development charges and a few other points, but doesn't even mention multiplexes, a major omission. The NDP platform does, but only up to 4 units, while the Greens propose 6 in bigger cities, which actually matters a lot for places with higher land costs and higher housing demand. Overall, I appreciate the clear recognition that if you care about affordability but don't like sprawl, the number one thing you need to do is make it easy to build a lot of housing close to jobs, amenities, and public transit.